This lecture is named after one of our founders, Philip J. Bowman, who, with other campus leaders, had the intellectual vision, the political tenacity, and the dedication of heart to create a place on UIC's campus that's committed to advancing a particular kind of scholarship among its faculty, a scholarship among faculty whose research is committed to addressing the most urgent needs, urgent social problems related to race, ethnicity, gender, those other intersecting variables that could be addressed by public policy. We are very grateful to Professor Bowman that in creating IRPP, he and his co-conspirators, among them faculty, staff, community members, organized a unit on this campus where UIC's mission to support research that matters the most to those disadvantaged neighborhoods in the city and our connections to neighborhoods around the world could be conducted by faculty who are committed to breaking down the walls that are sometimes constructed between academic scholars and experts who live outside of those walls around the city, where collaborations could lead to real and meaningful change towards the goals of racial justice and equality. That's what IRPP's work is, research by faculty and collaborators with the goal of racial justice. A fuller description of our work, the faculty we support, the projects that we fund, the community groups that we collaborate with, and the initiatives that we've undertaken in the last few years can be found in other places. Take a look at our website, pick up our brochure or our newsletter, spend some time during the reception looking at the posters that are displayed around the room. They provide amazing profiles of the scholars and fellows who, from this campus, are doing this remarkable work. For today, I hope that those of you who are just getting to know us will leave here understanding that there are faculty in almost every department on UIC's campus working alongside our students with a dedicated group of community partners to make a difference, making a difference confronting issues like school closings, persistent racial segregation, gun violence, queer and trans health issues, wealth disparities, and more. This is research that is intellectually rigorous. The students and faculty who are involved in it are authentically engaged, and the collaborations that they have formed are strong, in no small part because of the vision of our founders, including Philip J. Bowman. We have support from units on campus as well, and I'd like to talk with you for a moment about one of our key collaborators, Professor Barbara Ransby and the Social Justice Initiative. Now, Professor Ransby, as I look around this audience, needs perhaps no introduction. Many of you who are from the community of Chicago outside of UIC know her as a longtime feminist activist whose intergenerational and international work has touched many lives. Many of you know her as the public intellectual whose timely and pointed, stark analysis offered in places like the Miami Herald, the Detroit Free Press, in these times the progressives, help us understand over and over again with clarity how race, gender, class, and other variables intersect. You might follow her on Twitter. You might follow her on Twitter, really. You might see her on Democracy Now! I have no doubt that many of you also know, of course, her scholarly work, her biography, award-winning biography of Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, Radical Democratic Vision, her highly acclaimed new book, Eslanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson. Those of you on campus, of course, know that we owe a great debt of gratitude for her relentless academic advocacy, professor of history, African American studies, and gender and women's studies, and her former role as vice provost for planning and programs. But for today, the new founder and director of UIC's Social Justice Initiative. The Social Justice Initiative is one of IRPP's key partners on campus in many things that we do. including support for the Bowman Lecture this year, which, in addition to it being our 10th anniversary year, is the first in a series of events commemorating the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. I invite Professor Barbara Ransby now to tell more about that work.
Thank you. Can always count on Beth Ritchie to give a lovely and gracious introduction and embarrass you. I said to her, her introduction was longer than my remarks. This is really, it's wonderful to be here because the Phil Bowman Lecture has really become a landmark on this campus. The turnout today on this cold Chicago day is testimony to that. We always love to have Phil Bowman back with us for this lecture, and to see colleagues and have such a distinguished speaker each year. And certainly Professor Ogletree is highly distinguished and inspirational, and we've been chatting with him a little bit before coming here today, and I'm very eager to hear his remarks. So thank you for coming. I feel like I should give an introduction to Beth Ritchie, who will now come up. But Beth Ritchie's leadership of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy really has been an inspiration to many of us on this campus, and has created the space that a social justice initiative could come to occupy. And so we're deeply grateful for that collegiality and comradeship. I was asked to say just a few words about Freedom Summer because both Pedro Noguera's talk that was hosted by the Great Cities Initiative, this talk today, are really a part of a continuing discussion of our engagement with history and our engagement with historical moments that offer us insight and inspiration as we look around us today and as we look forward. Why Freedom Summer? 1964 was a very important year in this country's history. But when we look at Freedom Summer, and myself as a civil rights, Black freedom movement historian, it was a time both of opportunity and enormous potential, a time of danger and violence, and as Dr. King would have said, a time of urgency. And I feel all of those things when I think of the political landscape today. But out of Freedom Summer, a group of young people allied with their elders, a group of Northerners allied with Southerners, forged alliances and solidarities, engaged in struggle and made mistakes, looked to rural, sometimes semi-literate sharecroppers and farmers and maids for intellectual guidance and for political guidance. And I think that's really important and really captures the spirit of some of the social justice work we're trying to do on this campus, some of the work that IRPP and the Great Cities Initiative and many other units on campus really embrace, which is to suggest that there's reservoirs of knowledge beyond the academy. And in fact, we have to encourage our students to look beyond our classrooms to learn how to be both decent human beings and historical actors, and not just successful professionals. When I think of the inspiration of a Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, or an Ella Baker, or an Annie Devine, or a Unita Blackwell, some of the people who were the elders and the local people in Freedom Summer, I think these weren't people who probably would have gotten very good ACT scores or SAT scores. They were people who never made it to high school, so there wasn't a GPA. So, and yet they were people who created the space that we now occupy. They were people who were enormous educators and teachers for Harvard-trained students who went down. One of them, our colleague Peter Orris, who's a medical doctor here at UIC and who was one of the youngest Freedom Summer volunteers to go to Mississippi in 1964. But he was tutored by a Fannie Lou Hamer and an Annie Devine and a Unita Blackwell. And so I think we who have been trained in the academy have to come to our work very humbly, and certainly have to come to social justice work very humbly. And it is really the spirit of Freedom Summer that inspires that humility. On this campus going forward, there'll be other events between now and the summer, but I want to invite all of you, and many of you in this room are already collaborators and supporters of this project. It's a conference called Freedom Dreams that will happen at the end of May 28th to the 30th. Angela Davis will come, Julian Bond will be our keynote, Rosa Clemente will be here, Robin D.G. Kelly, and a number of other people, but also some young people who I think are this century's freedom fighters and Freedom Summer leaders, the young people from Florida, the Dream Defenders, the Black Youth Project organizers, some of the immigration rights students, some of whom come from this very campus, students from University of Michigan. So we'll invite all of those young activists to join with discussions with scholars and policymakers and others. And so I'm very happy that Beth invited me to say a few words about Freedom Summer. I won't say more than that, but I will certainly invite all of you to stay tuned on the IRPP website, on the Great Cities Initiative website. The College of Education has also been very supportive to us in something called the Pipeline to Justice, which is a new scholarship fund to not just bring the valedictorians to UIC, but also to bring community organizers to UIC to get their degrees. And I think that's a very important project, and we thank Dean Tatum. Also looking at Dean Pagano and Dean Paul Brantroff, who have been very supportive of the social justice initiative here on campus. And so that's what I call doing work as outsiders within. That is, people who have certain ethics and sensibilities, who when they can leverage power, leverage it in on the side of justice and inclusion. And so we're glad to be here, and I'm glad to be here among the kind of colleagues that I work with. Lisa Lee is another person who's been an enormous inspiration to the work that we do, bringing art into the mix when we talk about social justice and social change. And so those are the values and the ideas that we carry with us in trying to do this work on this 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, and we invite all of you to be a part of it. So thank you.
I suppose it's no coincidence that it's our 10-year anniversary on the 50th anniversary year of Freedom Summer, and we're thrilled to be looking forward to those ongoing collaborations. It's now my deep pleasure to introduce Professor Charles J. Ogletree. Charles Ogletree is the Jesse Clemenko Professor of Law, Director of the Criminal Justice Institute, and Executive Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard University. One of the most prominent legal theorists of our time, Professor Ogletree's scholarship and litigation work spans a range of issues related to racial justice, voting rights, reparations, disproportionate minority confinement, constitutional protections, institutional access, to name a few. As a legal scholar, he's the author or co-author of critically important books, which we have on sale here for you today. One is All Deliberate Speed, called by John Hope Franklin an essential work on race and affirmative action. We're also selling Life Without Parole, which is an edited volume looking at the ways that parole has become sort of a de facto occasion for civil death for some people, and the presumptions of guilt, which explores the issues of race, class, and crime through the lens of the arrest of Henry Louis Gates at his home in Cambridge in 2009. As a public intellectual, his frequent appearance in the national media seriously influences the way that we talk about racial justice from the legal perspective. He was the moderator of the State of Black Union. He served as moderator in the PBS series of Ethics in America. He was the NBC legal commentator for the O.J. Simpson case, and important to many of us, he was legal counsel to Professor Anita Hill during the Senate confirmation hearings for Justice Clarence Thomas. More recently, and we frequently hear him and see him on MSNBC, on the Today Show, the McNair News Hour, and Meet the Press. He's the recipient of dozens of awards. I couldn't name them all, but you should know 6 of them were honorary law degrees. He was named the People's Lawyer of the Year from the National Congress of Black Lawyers and received the 2002 Equal Justice Award from the National Bar Association. Professor Ogletree, of course, I could go on and on about your work. You have many, many accomplishments, and your influence has been felt in the key legal debates that those of us who are students of racial justice look to. You have profoundly impacted how we understand race and the law, and civil rights, questions of citizenship. For me, that you continue to work with local organizations on political issues you're a pillar in the field, an esteemed legal scholar, and yet you connect with people sort of as a citizen of the world, and care deeply, obviously, in the work that you do, the discussions that you have around issues of race, rights, and justice. That posturing, assuming those positions, is something that we at UIC and in IRPP admire deeply. We're therefore very grateful and deeply honored to have you as the Philip J. Bowman Lecturer on Race and Public Policy as a kickoff to our Freedom Summer activities and in commemoration of our 10-year anniversary. Welcome.
Let me start by thanking Beth for this wonderful introduction and for being here. I've been very impressed with the work that's been done. And I'm going to save some time as well, particularly for questions from faculty, other individuals and students as well. And I have a timekeeper somewhere who will let me know when I run out of time. I'll talk forever. We have an agreement that I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then have some time for your questions. And if I don't answer them, I have a few cards left. I'll give you those and have a chance to talk about those as well. I wanted to first thank Phil Bowman for both inaugurating this lecture series and for being a part of what we do here. And what is amazing for me is that I'm a kid from a very small community in California called Merced, California, a very small town. It's amazing to see where I am now. And I don't want people to read the resume and think that they know, well, this is a kid who has had it all. It's been tough. And it's tough getting here, and I think it's important that those of us who have succeeded in whatever we've done take the time to make sure that people who follow us understand that this is not the beginning of who we are, it's the middle part, and we're going to talk about the beginning. I think that's very important to put that in context. And I want to also thank a classmate and a mentor of mine who's here at the medical school. Arnold Turner and I were both at Stanford at the same time. He was there a little bit earlier, and I was at Stanford in the early 1970s. And I met my wife there. And just for the record, she was 8 years old. I don't want anybody to think that she's as old as I am. She was from Baltimore, then Compton, and went to Stanford in 1971, and I met Pam there. And we were married after our senior year, graduated in 1975. I've been happily married for 38 years. Happily, I say, with a little bit of an asterisk. I remember that as we were leaving Stanford after our marriage, and there were two issues. One was I was unfortunately inflicted with the male's attitude about driving across country. Pam asked, I think now, a very sensible question. Charles, shouldn't we get maps to decide how to go from California to Cambridge? I said, maps? Why do we need maps? You just go outside and make a left turn and drive from California to Boston. And I got lost I don't know how many times. And I just, the reason I remember this is I remember hearing, remember some people who remember payphones. You could call and make a payphone. And she had to put a lot of quarters in the payphone, but I remember her talking to her father. I just heard one word that sort of shocked me, and it was the word annulment. We had been married for days, right? And it was clear that her and her father were having a discussion about, you just married him, you can let him go anytime. And thank God she held on for all these years. It worked out extremely well. And I also want to say this, when we talk about history, I want to talk about the 1964 importance of that freedom march in '64, but I also want to talk a little bit about the one that happened a decade before in 1954. The people should understand that. And you don't have to get the history from me, and you heard a little bit of it today, but I'm amazed at how great it was for an African American media extension back in the early 1900s covered a lot of this information. And that's the Pittsburgh Courier. No matter where you were or what you did, there was a sense about the history of the African American community, and the Pittsburgh Courier covered a lot of that, which I think was very important to make sure that that happened. And I also wanted to say that in many respects that there is a sense of history that we forget. And you heard a little bit about it already from the earlier discussion today about the history. But I'm thinking about something that I learned not through reading the history books, but through a friend who grew up in Mississippi and who was a neighbor of who else? Medgar Evers. And his wife, who was an NAACP leader until she recently retired, Myrlie Evers, a prominent woman in the civil rights movement. And this young man who was a lawyer with me as a public defender in the 1970s and 80s, told me about witnessing Medgar Evers being shot and killed in his own yard as Myrlie Evers and their young children watched him being assassinated by a white Klansman. Early in this movement, to think that children could see their father being assassinated, we can't forget that history. I think that's very important that we have a good sense of that. And so I want to talk about that as well, and how important this Freedom Summer was. Let me say a word before I get to that as well. I grew up in a different generation, having been born in Merced in 1952. I'm not afraid to mention my age. And I think it's important because the person who had an enormous amount of impact, there were two people. One was a Mexican who was organizing farm workers to be involved in the demonstration about wages and conditions, was Cesar Chavez. As somebody who there should be a recognition of what his role was in California in particular in the 20th century, and what a big difference he made in the 1900s. And he was followed by a woman who was very active, Dolores Huerta. People should know that history to understand what we're talking about today, because it was a multiracial movement, whether it was 54, whether it was Cesar Chavez, whether it was 64, the freedom rides, all that, there was a multiracial component to that, and I want to make sure that people understand that. Dr. King understood it in 1954, and the people who organized the Freedom Summer of 64 also understood it. And we've lost touch with that, the idea that there's a multiracial group of people who are young, who are middle class, who are older, who are seniors, who have an important role in what we think about going into the 21st century, what we have to do as well. And I think that's important to appreciate. And it's also interesting to think about the 1954 movement, the March on Washington. Let me be clear, I was 2 years old. And so I don't exaggerate that I was there, had something to do with it. I was very young, right? But my parents kept talking about it, and they were watching, and I don't know, there are very few people here who remember this, but back then, the televisions were only black and white, right? And you only had access to a very few number of stations, right? And if you were a child like me, you didn't watch the TV. My father sat in front of it, my mother sat beside it, and we sat way in the back, had to look over their shoulder to try to watch what was going on. And I started to say something. I said, no, they are kicking my behind if I just make a point about it. I want to watch this too. They were not those kind of accepting parents who would forgive that. And I can say it now, but I would not have said it in my formative years. But it was important to watch this, and they were watching. And I remember to this day, my father was from Birmingham, Alabama. Mother was from Little Rock, Arkansas, and they met in the early 1950s before I was born, and got married in 51, and I was born in 1952. And so they were Southerners who came to California looking for jobs and opportunities. My mother didn't work. My father was a truck driver, and they had their struggles. And it was very interesting. And it was different growing up at that time. And I think it's important for people to understand that before '64, what it was like. And I remember being around my grandparents, and people call them, we don't call them anymore, people call them Big Mama and Big Daddy, right? Because they were big, number one, but they were also the folks who, in a sense, brought the community together. They were very important, and that was important. And I think there are a couple of people, whether they'll hold their hands up or not, but how many people remember outhouses other than me? Okay, now, and young people saying, what the heck is he talking about? Well, when you didn't have a toilet inside your house, you said, what? How could you live? We didn't have a toilet inside our house. We didn't have a cooking stove inside our house. We had a fireplace where you can cook things, and the toilet was outside, and the outhouse was where my grandfather had built the house, built an outhouse where you wouldn't use the bathroom in the house, you'd go to the outhouse, right? Outside, because you would leave a smell. And I remember going to the outhouse as a little kid, and he had cut these two big holes where you would use the men's room and women's room, who's ever going to use it, right? People were nodding with agreement, right? And it was interesting because I know as a kid, 4 or 5 years old, I almost fell in the hole, right? And you couldn't do that because it was a mess in the hole, right? You could smell it coming outside your house, but it's real. And I think people should understand that today, understand what that meant. There was no such thing as a shower. There was no such thing as a bathtub, right? And all these things are what we've learned, and we have to make sure that we translate it into a reality so that people will understand that, what people were going through in the 50s and what they were going through in the 60s and what they were going through before that. Do you remember the time when gas cost something like 25 cents per gallon? Yeah. And now you're looking at $3, $4, or more dollars a gallon, 25 cents a gallon. My grandfather would raise hell about that, right? And I remember him driving this big car that he had with his 25 cents a gallon gas, and you can smell him coming up the street, parking, or going down the street. It was terrible. I mean, you're talking about environmental concerns. There were none when I was a kid. There were none. It didn't have an impact on him. He was happy to have a car and make sure that, seat belts, they didn't exist, right? I mean, it's a different world, and I just want people to have this context when you get into the 50s and the 60s. And there are a lot of unknown people, particularly women, who played an important role. I mentioned Dolores Webster, but a lot of women who played an important role in the civil rights movement from the beginning all the way to now, and I think that people should understand that. People know a little bit about Dorothy Height and what her important role was in these struggles. People know a little bit about, but not enough about Rosa Parks and how she was a remarkable, brilliant woman who followed Dr. King in the march before the March of Washington, what she was able to do. And some people may know Queen Mother Moore. Have you heard that name? That was a woman who was very active. And you talk about uneducated women, the fact that she was smarter than anybody in the room, in the building, and she taught us a lot of lessons about the struggles. And people have very little sense about people like Fannie Lou Hamer and her remarkable effort. And I say that people need to understand that because we talk about all these things, but I remember Fannie Lou Hamer reading about her and what she did in 1964. The Democratic National Convention was held and this wonderful place, that's a casino place on the East Coast, right? And she was there, and she was part of the Democratic Freedom Party, and people had little idea that this Southern woman had any role, but she was trying to make it clear that no, I should be let in this building like everybody else because I have something to say. But she had very little opportunity to have her voice heard, even though she played a big role in this movement, and I think we should make that known as well. And I also think that when we think about the history, we always talk, and I think it's appropriate, talk about Dr. King and all that he did, but how could you forget about Bayard Rustin and how much impact he had? And part of the resistance to bring Bayard Rustin into the movement, people talk about him, because he was a man about something that no one would have understood in the early 1940s and 50s he was a gay man. And that was oh, you don't talk about that. Dr. King never bothered about that. It was never an issue to stop him from respecting that Baird was a smart man, a great organizer, intelligent, a designer. And we need to understand and lift these leaders up who made a big difference in what we were able to do. And he was one of many that I could name that makes a big difference. And that's important. And I just wanted to do it before we get, before I get into the second part of my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about these books. How many people were at the 1964 Freedom Summer and went to Mississippi or some other place? Could you just stand people who were there in '64? Nobody. That's interesting. Now, I asked that question for a number of reasons. When I usually talk about 64, 54, there's always somebody who stands up who's about 25 years old. They weren't even born in 1954 or 1964, but they, yeah, I was there. They have no idea. When you talk about the people who were beaten crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge before Dr. King made it, had a walk after that, and there were people who have made incredible sacrifices more than a half a century ago, who should be recognized for what they did and how important it was. And when you think about the Freedom Summer of 1964, I was only 12 years old, but it was a memorable point that I think that people should recognize, because what made it so effective is that it was one of the movements, like Dr. King's movement a decade earlier, that was multiracial. That means women and men from every walk of life was a part of it. I just had an event Monday in Boston with whoever than Harry Belafonte. And people don't realize that Harry Belafonte was involved and was brought a lot of money to Dr. King, drove him places that he couldn't go, was very supportive. He brought people like Marlon Brando and other actors to all these civil rights movements. He integrated the civil rights movement. And his idea was, Harry Belafonte's idea was, you can't have a movement if you don't involve everybody. And it was very important for King for that to happen. And I say that now that we have to think about what we're doing in the 21st century, about how important that is. And I wrote this book, and this the first book, All Deliberate Speed, that is in a sense a personal reflection on growing up a kid from a place like Merced and going to a place like Stanford and a place like Harvard Law School. Now it's important, if you read the books and look at the books, I didn't talk about the glory of Stanford, the glory of Harvard. I talked about some of the challenges, the racial challenges. You don't just get to Stanford just because you're black. You have to show something. And then I urge people not only to be a student there and a brilliant student, but also have an effective way to make a big difference, because people in places like Stanford and Harvard were there before I came, and they opened up the doors for me, and I knew that. And my point was that I'm there, and even though I was Phi Beta Kappa, graduated in 3 years, and I wanted to, make it clear that I was there for a purpose. I was not the first African American there, first Latino there, but people were making Stanford a place, and Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all these other institutions opened their doors to everybody. So you have to continue to do that. And the difference between then and now, and this is not a criticism but a fact, the criticism is that you can look around and see there are a lot of people like me, first generation. There are a lot of people now that are first generation, but most of them are immigrants. And I'm not critical about immigrants, but the reality is that how many African Americans said, I'm the first person, not my mother, not my father, aunt, uncle, I'm the first person to go to college. It's just unthinkable, and we have to understand, why is it that class matters a lot more in our communities, all of our communities, than race? And even though race is a big factor, and we have to make sure we do that. And I'm not critical, and I talk about it in this book, that when you think about 1954, people say, what happened with the whole idea in 1954, May 17, 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education, argued by Thurgood Marshall, won unanimously before the Supreme Court, all white, all male Supreme Court. What was that case about? People said it opened up doors, but it did more than that. It taught people who were black and brown and who were middle class and not working class or poor, you can live anywhere you want to live. Because it opened up the door, says not only that you have the freedom to live in a community, but you have the freedom to do what you want to do to make a big difference. And that's exactly what they did, and that's what I talk about in this book. And I talk about everybody from Anita Hill, who I represented in the Senate hearings in 1991, to Clarence Thomas, who was on the other side. Talk about Supreme Court justices, presidents of the United States, a whole series of people who had an impact in one respect or another, and things that we were doing. And when you think about 64, how important it was, there hasn't been a demonstration like it. People, right now, this is the year. It's 50 years after 1964. And the point is, where will the march be? Where will the effort be? How important will it be? Will it be multiracial? Will it have the same influence? Will poor people be a part of it? Will people understand that in many respects, and I say this with all due respect, we as a community, I'm not talking about we in this audience, we are worse off in some respects in the year 2014 than many of us were and families were in 1964. And I say that because I think we have to understand that I have to keep talking about the fact that don't look at where you are now, look at where you're going to be. And I know I'm going to be kicked out of here pretty soon, but I'm just looking at these portraits. We have the same thing at Harvard Law School. And if you look back, and I'm not critical, they're all white and they're all male, right? And we know that this university, like any university, has women who graduated, and I have them, in a sense, not by myself, but change those posters to make sure they understand. And there are people who didn't graduate from Harvard, like Constance Baker Motley. Her photograph or portrait is at Harvard University. There are people who didn't graduate from Harvard, like Thurgood Marshall. There's a whole bust of him at Harvard University. Why? Because I want every student to realize that something happened here before you came here. And these folks may not have gotten a degree from Harvard, but they can make a big difference, and you should know who they are and what they are. And I tell them, as I'll tell you, the story of Thurgood Marshall. Brilliant man, I mean, just absolutely brilliant, from Baltimore. And he went to college in Pennsylvania, right? Because he wanted to make impact. He went to a black college in Pennsylvania before deciding to go to law school. And he was thinking about going to the law school where he grew up. He grew up in Baltimore, and he thought about going to the University of Maryland. It would not open up because no black had gone to the University of Maryland. But you know what he did? He and Charles Hamilton Houston, another African-American from Washington, D.C., went to Amherst College, tops of his class, was all male, came to Harvard Law School, first African-American on Harvard Law Review, made an important difference. But they represented the first African-American to ever go to the University of Maryland. And I have no idea what Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston said. It was something like this: how you like me now? They were making the point that every institution should be open to every talented individual, because that is what the whole struggle is about. And that's what he was trying to do. And that's what he made an enormous amount of difference in doing things of that nature. What's interesting about this book, and I hope, I know some people have it, I hope you'll look at it, and I'm going to answer your questions before you get a chance to answer them. There are pictures of people along the top, and if your copy is cut off, I didn't cut Clarence Thomas off because it's Clarence Thomas. That's the publisher or whoever the paperback was. There's a full picture of him. I said, well, why did you cut his head off? Are you mad with Clarence Thomas? I'm not, right? But that has something to do with the way that it's processed. All these people had something to do with civil rights then or now. And at the bottom, there's a photograph, and I want to make it clear before you get the book. There's a picture of these young people and who are preteens marching in the South with police on both sides. Does anyone have an idea what these young people were doing? The whole idea of where they were headed? Right, well, there's one guess. Who else? Right. Well, you know, what happens is that these young people were involved in a demonstration. These are preteens, and they were arrested. These are 8, 10, 12-year-old children. Because one thing the movement understood, people who remember it, is that get young people to be involved in it. because police have reluctance to arrest them, but they give a message. And the same thing happened. I talked to a Harvard Law School graduate who was the chief judge of the Illinois Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in Illinois, Judge Robert Bale. And he said he was in a demonstration in the 1960s in Baltimore. And he said the same thing, that we knew that adults would get arrested, but they wanted everybody who was in high school to be part of it, because police would have a different issue. They would be treated by a juvenile judge. They wouldn't have a record. It would be disappearing. I'm not saying, don't say Ogletree said young people should be involved in demonstration. I know that's what somebody's going to be quoted and saying. But the whole idea is that it made an enormous amount of difference for young people to both understand and be a part of it. And that's what they were able to do, and that's what this book talks about. The second book is a newer book, and some of you have seen it, The Presumption of Guilt. This is about my friend and my client, Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. People have probably seen some of the series and know how important he is and things that happened to him. And he's a man, as I said in the book, was arrested in his own house by a white police officer who thought that had received a message from a woman saying that somebody seemed to be going in that house. And she said, and I give this woman enormous credit, because I think she is the one who told the truth. Because what she said, I went out and got the actual police recordings to figure out what did she say when she called. And this woman, her name is Mrs. Whalen, she said, there's some people who are going in this house. I don't know if they work there or they live there. So there was no presumption. Her point was, I'm telling you what I see. And then the dispatcher said this: are they black or Hispanic? Right? Are they still in the house? And she said, they're two large men, they look kind of Hispanic, but I don't know what they are. She never ever says what their race is, because she doesn't know, because she sees them going in the house. And they're already going in. And the police officer who filed the report after arresting Gates said, I got a report that there were two black men in backpacks. Now that is a profile about black men, because this was 2 blocks away from a high school that was predominantly African American and Latino men and women, a high school, right? And so the whole idea that I'm looking for people who happen to be black and brown with backpacks sounds like somebody from high school. It was not Skip Gates. Now, and the question is, people say, well, you defended Gates, but didn't Gates say a few things? Well, and Gates was, in a sense, different from most of us. I've been stopped by police and talked to police, and I talked to my kids about how to talk to police, and it's a different experience. He had never had to confront police. They've always been someone that he respected. And so he is, in a sense, on his, the police comes in and says, well, I'm here, I'm investigating a supposed burglary in the 21st century, 2010, and I want you to show me some identification. And Gates goes to his table and he pulls out his wallet. He has 2 IDs there, and he shows them to the police officer. And the police officer has his gun but never pulls it out. And he follows Gates to his table and follows Gates to pull him out. And Gates shows 2 IDs. Does anyone have any idea what he showed him first? Harvard University, right? Because in Gates' mind, this is about class. I am one of the chosen few, right? I'm a professor at Harvard University. And then the officer looked at that and they showed him another ID, his driver's license, which said where he lived on Ware Street, where this was happening, and that he was the occupant. And the officer said, okay, I'm gone. Gates was still fuming. Understand, right? And so the officer gave him the IDs back and says, I'm going to leave now. And he's walking out, and Gates said, I'm not through with you. Wait a minute. And Gates started cursing him, calling him names. And the officer was smart. The officer said, I went outside of the residence. And when I was outside of the residence, Gates started yelling at me so that other people could hear it. So I arrested him for what? Disorderly conduct. Because he's publicly telling people something, and I have the power to arrest him. I can't keep him in jail, but I'm going to put him in jail right then. And it tells you that Gates was thinking about you know, that you can, in a sense, class yourself out of being a black man or a black woman or Latino or Latino. You can't. You just can't. Because it makes an enormous amount of difference. People always ask me, well, what happens if Gates had been a woman? Would it have been different? I have no idea, but it's worth exploring, right? But the reality is that he was arrested, and the officer knew that he could arrest him, but he could not hold it. And his secretary called me. I went to the station. Gates was released within minutes. And that has something to do with class. I knew the police chief. I knew the people at the prison. I knew the people at the jail. I knew all these folks because the one thing I learned in any city, learn who the police chief is, learn who the mayor is, learn who the governor is, right? Because at some point, it's not to avoid an arrest, but it's important that you know who is running the city and the state so you can have something to say. And I can say, oh, this is the city run by Menino. Yeah, I know Tom very well. I invited him to Harvard once. Oh, Harvard? Yeah, that's where I work. Oh, you do? It changes the dialogue completely. And about the governor, said, you know, the governor's a friend of mine, Deval Patrick. Oh, Irish guy. No, he's not Irish. He's a brother, right? And he went to Harvard. And I know him, and I supported his campaign, etc. Patrick is black? Yes, he is, right? And all that makes an enormous amount of difference, the whole idea of race, class, and crime, what it means, and the difference of that. And that's what this book talks about. And so when you think about 1964, things have changed in a respect that changed. And yet, in many respects, they remain the same. And I hate to say this in a crowd like this, but what overwhelms me is that if you look at the data in the year 2014, I hope you would be shocked as I was, if not surprised, or maybe aware. There are more homeless people, black, white, women, and men in the year 2014 than it was in 1964. More homeless. How could that possibly be? There are more people in jails now in 2014 than there was in 1964. How could that be? Right? There are more people who are dropping out of high school, your children, or children who you know. And they're not dropping out because they're being kicked out. They're dropping out because they're bored. Whether you're smart or not, they just say, I'm wasting time. And they have the sense that, you know what, I don't need a high school job to work like our parents and grandparents were able to do. I said I'm talking to the elderly here like me, right? The whole idea that your background didn't matter. If you could do the job, cook, clean, drive, you had a job anywhere in the country. And that wouldn't stop it. It's different now. And telling young people that they should not be dropping out of high school is important. The data is very clear, and anybody who's 14 won't listen to this, but it's very important to tell them that the reality is this, that over 7,000 African American males have dropped out of school this month. 7,000, not 7, not 70, not 700, but over 7,000. Where are they going? What kind of education can they get? And we know that there's a relationship between, if you look at 1964, you could work almost anywhere and get a job. In 2014, you have to at least finish high school to get a job and take care of a family and send somebody to school. You can't do that now. And I'm talking about jobs and education, but it's even worse than that. If you think about housing, one of the things that Brown allowed people to do in 1954, and the freedom marches of the Freedom Summer of 1964 allowed people to do, is that you could, in a sense, live where you wanted to live, except in certain communities. Certain communities were restricted based on race. Now, it's interesting. If you look at African Americans in particular, and talk about African Americans, it's interesting from 1964 to 2014. I just showed this in class last week. This video of an African American community in Atlanta, right, and on the outskirts of suburban Atlanta, all black. And when asked about why they live in this community, the African Americans said because we wanted to live in a community where it was safe for our kids, schools were good, housing was great, we had a good job, and the police respected us. basic things that they had learned from whites who fled from these communities and went to the suburbs and other places. White flight, you hear you talk about that. This was, in a sense, a black flight, and which matters that your race, which points out that your race doesn't matter. Wherever you want to go, whatever you want to do, that's what you're able to do. And it's very interesting because when Skip Gates was asking this black family in this documentary, you know, well, why are you in an all-black community? And the black woman, who was a lawyer, said, well, we came from Detroit, from this north. We came down to Atlanta, a place in the South, because we could afford a house and we wanted to live there. And Gates asked the right question I would have asked. Like, well, wait a minute, this is all black community. Why is it all black? Why did you move to an integrated community? The wife said, well, we were in Detroit in an integrated community, but we were the only black family there. They were all white families. We thought we were mistreated, so we moved from Detroit to Atlanta. And Gates says, that sounds like that's racist. You know, you separate from whites. The husband said, oh, no. Whites are welcome to live here. Anybody who wants to can move here. And I can hear the smirk in Gates' voice because that's exactly what whites said decades ago. Blacks can live here if they want to. They are welcome to live here. But there's something about it we've learned to do exactly, because we made it in race, in class, we've learned to do exactly what people were saying they were doing 50 years ago. And that tells you the sign of what's happening. It is amazing too, that when you think about this, how different it is. In representing Gates, I have to say, and I've got just a couple minutes, I'm going to take some questions. It's very interesting when you think about the title of the book. I say the presumption of guilt. You know, why did Ogletree pick that title? Because for you to think about it, why is he saying the presumption of guilt? Because Gates was presumed guilty because he was in the house. And no one imagined, except his neighbors and friends, no one imagined that he had a right to be in this house. It just didn't make sense, right? Number one. And that he was doing that. Now the second presumption of guilt that turns it the other way around. Gates did not call the police, but you know the last thing he could do, he learned when he was handcuffed. He's handcuffed in the back. He says, "I can't walk. I'm disabled." And the officer put the handcuffs in the front. If you see him on the front cover, he's putting the handcuffs in the front. He's in the back seat, and I know none of you have been in police cars, but anybody who's been in a police car, you know that they don't have any handles, right? So you can't jump out, right? And so Gates is in the back seat, but he's smart. So he pushes his finger to put the window down. And he says to the secretary, Janet, call Tree, that's me, right? Because he realized I can get a free lawyer, right? He hasn't paid me today. Did I just say he hasn't paid me? He hasn't paid me a dime, right? But I went to the prison, saw him, and you can see all this, what it meant to somebody who thought, race doesn't matter, this is 2010, how could this still be an issue? It really is. It hasn't changed. This is July. He was getting ready to head to his house on Martha's Vineyard. Right, the whole idea that I have overcome all of these restrictions on race, because look at who I am, look at what I've done. He doesn't, if you ask him to sign this book or talk about it, he won't talk about the book. And I told him I was going to write the book. I gave him the right to write. He said, I'm not going to write, I'm pissed off at what happened to me. So I've written the book, but he still doesn't want to read it to figure out what exactly happened, because it tells a story about him and how people are treated differently based on class, not just on race anymore. The class has become an issue, and it makes the point no matter who you are. If you look at the back of it, it says, I issued this request for women and men to give me stories about what they've had, and most of the stories I got back were from African American men. It was an amazing group of people who were sending me faxes and letters and emails before I even asked for them about this book, and they had been arrested or stopped or presumed to not be the partner in the law firm, going to lunch. And these were not all criminal matters, they were civil matters in a lot of respects. And you'd be amazed at people that you will find in this book who were prominent and who had some things to do and what they had to go through. And that's why I wrote it, to make sure people understand it. This is a book for you, but it's also a book for children, when I say young adults, this is an easy book to read, and people have come to me and said, I thank you for giving my grandfather, uncle, mother the book, because I think it's very important, because I read it too. And that something like this happened to me. This is a very important experience that I had to go through. And this book tells you about what it means and why you have to do it. And if you look inside, there's also a picture of Gates and Vice President Biden and President Obama and Officer Sergeant, the sergeant who arrested him, Sergeant Crowley. All of them are at the White House having a beer summit. And a lot of women have the right to say, wait a minute, why are these men having a beer summit? Shouldn't we have a serious discussion on race? And I put it in here. A number of African Americans wrote me and said, before I finished the book, said, you know, you don't just talk about the beer summit as an event, talk about it. Why are you not talking about the president, how we're going to solve crime? Forget about the beer summit. And I think there were some things that he learned. In conclusion, let me just say this. When you think about 1964 and 50 years later, it's very amazing to see how far we've gone. Just a couple of days ago, Arnie Duncan, who's from Chicago, spoke in my class as well, talking about Chicago. Growing up here, going to school here, working here for many years, his family being involved in many issues in Chicago. And it was a very eye-opening issue for people to see. He says, I always wanted to be involved in education, and that's what I'm doing. But he also says, I can't find people who are looking for work because I want the Department of Education to be diverse. And I think that's very important. And so I think that, and I've been very critical, let me be clear, I've been very critical of President Barack Obama, my former student. I think he's done a good job in some respects. I've been very disappointed in him when it comes to race. He's afraid to talk about race. And I understand some of his misgivings. And I was very pleased a few weeks ago when he allowed Eric Holder, the Attorney General, to talk about something that should have been talked about decades ago. That is, black and brown men who have a record are going to be allowed to vote. And Eric Holder's story was because if you think about slavery, black men were not allowed to vote because everybody thought that they were criminals, they were trying to escape. That's not a crime, right? It shouldn't have been a crime. They were held in servitude, right? There's no question about that. And the president finally embraced, about 2 weeks ago, something called My Brother's Keeper. And the whole idea is to create jobs for young black boys. I think that's important, and it's better late than never, right? And so I'm hopeful that will happen. And you know he's coming back here, right? He's from Hawaii, and I was out there a decade ago, and people were saying, we can't do it. And he said, I'm not going back to Hawaii. But he came back here. He said, I'm coming back here to Chicago. And people who live near him and this part of Chicago know that the police are still guarding his house. You know, he's not there, right? And your house has been burglarized. Hey, where are the cops? They're guarding Obama's house, right? And that becomes a big problem. So I think as we think about it, we think about how much we've come. We've come a long way. If we look around this crowd in the 50 years since 1964, but yet, young people, we still have a long way to go. And the future is yours. It's in your hands. And I hope that you, the next generation of leaders of this country, will take us to the promised land that we didn't find in the 50 years that we've tried to lead America. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Professor Ogletree, for your personal, political, intellectual reflections on both institutions and movements. I particularly appreciate the focus, thinking about Freedom Summer, but also where we are now with attention to gender as well as race and class. I know there'll be lots of questions and discussion about that. Before we open it up to the floor, to begin our discussion, I'd like to invite Phil Bowman to come to the podium. So in addition to being one of the founding directors of IRPP, Dr. Bowman, some of you may know, was a professor of African American Studies at UIC. He's currently the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan, and one of the most important scholars and advocates for racial diversity and racial justice in higher education. He's read widely, cited often, recognized with numerous awards and honors, and we named this lecture after him because of all that, but more importantly, we named this lecture after him because he is the kind of scholar, the kind of administrator, and for many of us, the kind of mentor that many of us aspire to be. So welcome, Professor Bowman.
I'll be quick so people can ask questions of their own. And I was the founding director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity. I'm currently on sabbatical leave. And when I go back, I'm going to just be a regular professor and work with graduate students and have a small program of research and these stuff for the next year or so. One quick question. You know, first of all, I'm very humbled, you know, to be associated with a lecture by such a profound intellectual and scholar as Professor Ogletree, and I greatly appreciate, you know, coming through and sharing your wisdom with us. And just to know that we're connected to some degree, because I guess your mother's from Arkansas.
Right.
Yeah, it's a small world. I'm also Arkansas, you know, by way of or Arkansas to Michigan. But I know, and I'm really looking forward to also reading. Everyone purchase these books. I'm going to buy a set for my daughter, who wasn't able to come, but I'm going to buy an entire set for my daughter. So everyone purchase and read Professor Ogletree's books. I wanted to ask a question. I know, you know, you've done great work on race and public policy at multiple levels. You know, you obviously have, you know, expert on a national level, race and public policy issues, which is where much of your work has been. But you've also done the global, you know, work with South Africa. You know, so you're known to do race and public policy at that global, you know, cross-national, international level as well. And in addition, you know, this whole multi-level function of race and public policy at the national level, at the global level, and certainly at the institutional level, you know, you engage with the work with Skip, you know, at Harvard, you know, at the organizational level. But I've been particularly interested in your engagement at the local city level. You know, and here in Chicago, you know, where of course RPP does most of its grounded work, and I have a long family history in Detroit, and I'm currently back at the University of Michigan, and you know, spend a lot of time in Detroit with the major challenges that you have there. And I would know in Boston, you know, you get engaged. I haven't heard very much written about that, but I know you must have a lot of passion for it. And you also must think that it's an extremely critical location for commitment and work. You know, even though it doesn't come across in much of your scholarship. Right. You know, so I was just kind of curious for you to make a comment on why you think that's so important, and then also perhaps some lessons that you learned from your practice and work in Boston, and some implications for Chicago, or for that matter, Detroit or other cities.
Great, thank you. And let me say a word about Boston. And there's something about in the book, All Deliberate Speed, about my coming to Boston. But since so much happened since I've been in Boston, it's not there. The same sort of challenges that we were there in the early 70s in Boston when I was going to law school. And I came with my wife to Boston in 1975. And I saw all of these signs and everything else up, and I had no idea what was going on. And I called my landlord, where we were going to be staying when I was in law school, to ask him where were we, because I thought we were lost. And seeing these markers and all these things stopping people from driving here and taking things like that. And I described, I said, you know, I see Flanagan so-and-so and McCarthy so-and-so, and he said, get back in the car, right? I didn't realize I was in South Boston. I had not been reading the paper that there was a race riot going on, right? Because of busing. And the same thing that we talked about in California in the 70s in a different respect, it was news in Boston. And people think, Boston? There people are objecting to that? And what was interesting, and I didn't write about it as much as I should have, it was a class issue, not just a race issue, because they were in a sense putting the black community in terms of the busing in places where poor whites lived. And that's what they were objecting to. You know, why in places like this, why are you choosing our places to make sure that you have room for these blacks? Why can't they go to the suburban places or other parts of Boston? And the whites were, in a sense, why are we treated, you know, the working class whites treated like we don't belong here? And you want to integrate it. It was a very big problem. Now, switch it to the time I've been teaching at Harvard for over 30 years in the 80s. My students would come and they would say, particularly the black women, we can't go out to a club and get a cab back to Cambridge. And I thought that was very surprising. And the reason they couldn't get a cab because the cab drivers who were foreigners, they had learned everything about race and class and discrimination by reading about blacks and browns in America, right? And so they came in with an attitude. And the thing was that don't pick up a black person, particularly a woman or a man, because you're going to be robbed or killed or taken to Roxbury, right? Which is now becoming a suburban community, right? But the whole idea that was, and they came to me angry and frustrated. We can't go out to a club because we're treated like trash by the cab drivers. The mayor, who was the mayor for 20 years, Tom Menino, who's coming to my class in a couple of weeks, and just retired before this last election of mayors of Boston. He retired after 20 years. He said, this is not tolerable, and if your students want it, I'll make it possible for them. I'm going to have some buses come to pick them up in Cambridge and take them to see Boston. These were the duck boats. And these black women were saying, duck boats. But his point was, I'm going to show you, I'm going to take you to the river, I'm going to show you on the streets. These duck boats could go on water and on land. And he thought he was doing a great thing. And showing them all these new developments, and the black woman was saying, you know, I just want to get to Macy's. I just want to buy some stockings. But Tom, for him, he wanted to show them the culture, the museum, the parks, all the great things in Boston that they could not see, but they wanted to see, how do I get downtown and get back? We'd have a cab driver take me. And that is still, this is 2014, he's no longer mayor, but it's still an issue for black students. Why? It happened 2 years ago. There is a club in Boston, and it's a club where all the black law students, and they had a competition with the Yale black law students, a competition the day before on Saturday. And Saturday night, they were going to this club, this Cure, C-U-R-E Lounge. This is all known, Cure Lounge. And the owner who called one of his persons who monitored that said, you know, who are these black folks? And the security guy said, oh, those must be gangbangers, right? Because he never, and everybody was dressed in the nines. I mean, they looked very nice, but they were black, male and female, Harvard and Yale, in line to go into this club. And he wouldn't let them in and call the police because they were black, male and female, and kept them out. And they told me, the students told me about it, and we were able, this is 2012, I mean just a couple of years ago, maybe 2011, it was an amazing reaction to the fact that as far as we come, we haven't come far enough, because you still are, you can't clash your way out of it. But I'm from Yale, I'm from Harvard, look where I'm dressed in. None of that made a difference to the person in charge of security saying, these black folks. And now, the good thing about it is that we were able to sue Cure Lounge. And I won't tell you how much they gave up, but it was significant, to put it that way, right? Because they had to learn that they can't keep people out of their clubs. People were paying to go to their clubs, right? And the club, Cure Lounge. And we settled this case we brought the state Attorney General's office in, and everybody made a difference. But that's the difference in terms of what's happened. And that is still happening in some respects. And so students will call me and say, I just want you to know that I'm going down to Boston. I say, well, why are you calling me? Well, in case I get stopped, I want you to X, Y, and Z. And I have stories here of students who are now lawyers who would go shopping somewhere, and people here know it. You go to a certain store, and I'm not going to name the stores, but somebody would follow them around. And they would confront them, why are you following me around? And whether the security guard was black, white, male, or female, it didn't matter. They said, what is this person doing? And I thought they were exaggerating, but I don't know how many people saw very recently on CNN and MSNBC and other stations, African Americans with a lot of money, I mean, lots of money. They were going to Barney's, Macy's, and other places in New York, right? And they were ushered out not by the New York police, but by security at these places saying, there's a black male, he obviously can't afford to shop at Barney's or Macy's. And these folks had hundreds and thousands of dollars on them to buy suits and clothes and things like that, and shoes. They had all the money, but and I went with Reverend Sharpton, and we had a session with the person at Macy's, and he apologized and asked me to come and talk to his staff about diversity and understanding it. And his staff was diverse, right? Black, brown, yellow, male, female, all that. But the idea was that they still had a sense that a black male coming into a store didn't belong there and was probably going to steal something or rob them. All these things would turn out to be false, and that's part of what we had to do in the 21st century, because the problems were still as significant. And I could tell my own story. I don't tell it in the book as I did, but I think a lot about Colin Powell. And I think in New York right now, if I wearing this suit, wearing a coat, yell for a cab, I can't get a cab. The cab drivers are foreign. And no matter where I am, I'm on Fifth Avenue, I'm on places that sell and expect you to have money, right? But I'm an African American. They see my face. They don't see anything else. They see my face and they'll drive by me. And you know, what makes it heartbreaking and also warm is that white men or white women will say, sir, are you trying to get a cab? Let me stop one. And they'll get a cab, open the back door, and say, sir, you know, why don't you get in, right? The cab driver will look like, you know, but they can't stop me. But that's an accommodation that still is not a solution to the problem. They have to, in a sense, accept that I have the money to pay, because the idea that you're going to be killed or robbed or taken away in your cab is so foreign. It doesn't make any sense. But how do we educate people? The same problems that we had in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s are happening in 2014. And I'm sure that people here have experienced it, not just in Boston or New York or other places, but you know, try to hail a cab, and maybe you have more success here. No, but to me it was a heart warming experience to see that at least somebody running a department said, I'm going to tell all my workers, if they stop you again. And I don't want them to do something for me. I want them to do something for Jamal and Jamila, who are going to the store and trying to spend some money, because they can. And they go all the way uptown, and they should be allowed to shop the same way that I'm allowed to shop. And I think that business. And I'm tired of carrying Colin Powell's book around saying, My American Journey, thinking they'll stop and pull over and let me get in the cab. That doesn't help at all, right? Colin Powell's not in the news anymore. And they don't even read the title. And they think that I'm trying to sell them a book, right? I'm just trying to say, stop for a moment and before you take me elsewhere. Yes, go ahead.
So I was going to now open it up for other people to ask questions and join in the discussion. We'd like you to line up at the mic and maybe say who you are and briefly ask a question or make a statement if you have something you want to contribute to the discussion. And I'll tell you, so be thinking about it now, because we're only going to do this for about 15 minutes. Then we're going to go to some books on it. So.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Lisa Lead. I'm the director of the School of Art and Art History here. And I'm wondering, SJI has been showing sort of Eyes on the Prize recently, and a lot of the young people who have been going there mentioned to me that These days, there's sort of a sense that the legal apparatus is not so clear cut, which are the laws which are racially oppressive, right? That back then in the civil rights movement, it was clear that there was sort of Jim Crow, there was all these things that they should be fighting against, but now the laws are not so obvious. So for example, stand your ground, or what, and so I guess I wanna ask you, what do you find to be the most legally oppressive, racially oppressive laws out there that young people should be rallying to actually fight and change?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, and I'm going to talk about Henry Hampton, who did Eyes on the Prize. First of all, I think that everybody, that should be a required consumption piece for everybody in every family at every level. And that means in middle school, I think you'll understand in middle school, but certainly in high school, it should be, and have discussions, because no one talks about, at a regular sense, race and class in the 21st century. We have to make sure that people understand that people are different. That makes an enormous amount of difference, and I think that would be one way to capture it. Another thing is that, I have to tell you, I'm on a campaign now with lawyers from Florida to get rid of Stand Your Ground. It just makes no sense anywhere. And it doesn't say it in the law, but if you look at the history of Stand Your Ground, and I have, it doesn't say it, but it was designed to say you can carry a weapon because they might be trying to rob you, right? And so we have the right, we people of color have the same right to use Stand Your Ground, but it's a bad law. It's a terrible law when you want to arm yourself to protect yourself. And Eric Holder said this, we need to talk about self-defense and how you can do that and what authorities the police officer has to say. And I say in this book, as I say everywhere, the police need to represent who we are. And I'm not against being a police officer. Male, female, black, white, doesn't matter what your race or ethnicity or gender is, our sexual orientation is, but the whole idea is that we need to have police forces that represent all of our communities, because you'll see things enormously different. And I think that if a woman or an African American or an Asian American or Native American, a Latino, somebody had seen Gates at his house, they would have asked some other questions rather than presume that he had done something wrong, right? And they would have, and think about it, and I give Sergeant Crowley credit, he didn't know the neighborhood, but and here's what Skip says, the first thing when he got to the doors, was he was angry. Do you know who I am? That's the first thing he said. And the officer kept looking at his ID. Do you know who you're messing with, right? And you can imagine the officer's temperature is going up. And that's what's called, for folks, there's not a crime, you should know, that's called contempt of cop. You can't make a cop angry, right? And this third thing broke the lever of all this. And he said, are you doing this because I'm a black man and you're a white police officer? Oh boy, right? Right? And you can see that it's escalating. And Crowley's saying, I don't know who this guy is, but he's absolutely crazy. I'm going to do something because he's just insulted me, right? And so that's what we have to train people to understand what that means. That it means no matter what your ethnicity is, class, you are still in that pool of people, and your race or ethnicity will not be changed because of your class. I say that in the book. People say, wait a minute. We have to be able to earn our way or buy our way or move our way out of this. It doesn't matter where you live, what you do, what school you go to, where you shop. All those things are important, but you still will be influenced by your ethnicity. And I say that to say I have no idea if anybody will be stopped leaving this university, but I wouldn't be surprised if anybody stopped leaving this university. And folks have asked me, well, but I'm a white, I'm a male, and they police stop me all the time. I said, it might have something to do with what you wear. And it's amazing how people will, police and law enforcement people can't find anything else. It'll be, well, he's wearing these baggy overalls and these big boots, etc. That may be enough to create suspicion. And I think we as a community have to say, we can't do this, and we have to have a sensible conversation with somebody as opposed to assuming that there's probable cause enough to do something that makes a big difference. Yes? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Professor Ogletree. I really enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
My question is about institutional racism.
Mm-hmm.
I know so many African Americans, who are miserable, you know, in their jobs because they have to deal with incidents. And I know that I'm sort of a few years younger than you, so I'm near retirement. But, you know, my choice was to call out, you know, folks on stuff. And I do feel like I paid a price for it by being marginalized and probably not moving up in the department the way I should have. And so I have found other ways to grow, you know, to circumvent that. But what is your advice for young people? I mean, I feel like, you know, if you don't say anything, and I know a lot of people who decided not to do that, then how do you make things better for people, you know, African Americans that are coming behind you, or you leave, you're not really making things better. So what is your advice for, you know, being in that situation, and how do you deal with it?
It's an excellent question. Let me answer it in a variety of ways. First thing is that you're not alone, right? There are a lot of people who have had that experience, and sometimes you have to find a senior person in and around you to say, have you ever had what I've had? This, that, is insulting, and a lot of this is in the book, but the whole idea is that you'd be amazed at the number of people who are at the top of the ladder have experienced some form of discrimination or disrespect coming up, and they want to decide what to do. And I'll give you one example. A friend of mine who's unfortunately passed away just a couple of years ago is John Payton, a great lawyer, civil rights lawyer, was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York. And he has a story in the book that he told me about before he passed away. He was working in his law firm, a prominent national law firm in Washington, D.C. It was one Saturday. And he was going down to the garage, like everybody does, parking in the garage. And he was going to his car, and there was a secretary working for somebody else, but obviously didn't know him. But she worked at the same firm. And she jumped in her car, and she saw that this man coming down, and she immediately locked her doors and started her car and drove off. And I was saying, John, why didn't you say something to her when she came back to the office? He said, because that would have just added insult to injury, because she would not have understood that she would see me as a supervisor telling her that she'd done something wrong. She wouldn't see me as a black man who's been offended, right? And so he had this dichotomy, what do I do? And that became part of it. And I say that to say, I just got a call this morning here in Chicago from my institution, where the black staff members are saying, you know, we've been mistreated. We haven't been called for raises, for benefits. We're not on the dean's list. I have to respect the dean, who's from this fair city, a good friend of mine, and have this candid conversation with her. Said, every year we have a ceremony awarding staff members with the great work they've done. Where are the black women and men? They obviously have done great work here. They could not be here for decades if they hadn't done great work. And this is a progressive, thoughtful dean. And the point is that she probably is not aware of the fact that subconsciously she has selected people without thinking that where's the diversity in my selection? And the fact that people come, they're happy, they enjoy it, free food, all that stuff, right? It is still something, because I'm noticing, but the staff noticed. I didn't make this move. The staff came to me and said, we have been here for decades. And this is a new dean. She's only been here for 5 or 6 or 7 years, but the reality, we have not had a single African American or Latino, male or female, honored with these awards. It's not only an award, but it's also a check. And that begins to tell you that she's made up in her mind, I know this head of this department, I know that head, but she needs to know all of them. And I think that becomes part of it. And so what I'm doing, it will be very interesting. This is going to be shocking, but I have a meeting planned with the dean about something totally unrelated. She wants to talk about it. And this is going to be on my agenda. Make sure that she understands that, because I think that becomes a part of what needs to be done.
Thank you for your remarks.
Thank you.
My name is Caroline Swinney, and my question involves voting rights. That's just under siege. I'm sick about what's happening in Ohio right now. And you and I are contemporaries as far as age is concerned.
And we remember the movement. And so my question for you is, where is the collective outrage and the pushback?
That's a good point. Let me tell you what I did in 2008, which gives you a sense about voting rights and where it is right now. There are a lot of people who were concerned about legislators across the country, from New Hampshire to Florida, and Florida is the worst of the states, in my view, changing their laws by saying things like people need to be registered to vote, and they for decades had allowed people to walk in same day and go to a library, things like that. You can vote in your neighborhood, and that was very important. And so what I did was go around and talk to people about, you need to make sure that this works. Now, I don't like the fact that the state of X requires you to register to vote. But my point was, and I may be in the minority here, I said, register to vote. Go ahead and vote. Vote, I want you to vote in this election, but register to vote. Let's do whatever they said. It's not, we had to go through, our folks had to go through literacy tests. We had to pay fees in order to vote. I mean, if you think about before 2000, in 2004, 2008, 2012, we had an enormous number of hurdles to overcome in order to simply vote, right? And that makes it happen. And I said another thing, I said, there are two things that you can do here that they can't stop you because of your race, your gender, sexual orientation, and your class. And that is vote, number one. And number two, unless you have a record, they can't stop you from serving on juries. And I had a big plea, and some of you see me on the radio or television, before the trial of Trayvon Martin's killers, George Zimmerman, the killer. I was telling black folks, don't refuse to vote because you're angry that George Zimmerman has been indicted and Trayvon Martin, there's going to be a criminal case. In that case, as you remember, the district attorney from that part had indicted second-degree murder, right? And number one, that means you had a jury of 6 rather than 12, right? That's what you could do, a second-degree murder. And people keep asking me, well, you know, I think they fixed the jury selection because it was all women. They didn't fix it, right? That just happens, that women were the next 5. And there was one black woman and I think one Latina among the people who were on the jury. After the verdict, you can't say anything, it's too late then, right? They said, well, I think George Zimmerman was guilty. Well, you know, you should vote with that. And the same thing happened in the case of the young man, Jordan Davis, I think that's his name, who was shot and killed just recently by a white male after an argument. Remember that case? Right? And out of Florida again. Right, he was convicted of lesser offenses and a lot of time, but he was not convicted of first-degree murder because the jury was split on whether or not he should be convicted. And to her credit, the district attorney has re-indicted him and on first degree, and he's going to have a jury. But again, I don't want black people or brown people to say, you know, I'm so angry I can't serve. You have to serve. You have to be part of it because, believe me, being a lawyer, having practiced in criminal law for a long time, in DC, the juries were, when I was practicing in the 70s, 80s, they were overwhelmingly black. The jails were full of black males and a few black females and Latinos and Latinas. The jury had no reluctance at all to convict somebody because of their race. And people have it wrong, thinking, well, if you're black, you're going to walk away, because the jury would never convict a black man of a crime. That's not true. The jury would convict you in a millisecond, right? There's no question about that, right? And look you right in the face and said, you know, Tyrone, you did it. That's why we convicted you, right? Or at least we think you did it. And I think that becomes a part of the jury. And I'm not saying go out and convict. I'm just saying go out and serve. I think that becomes an important part of what we need to do in order to address these issues. I think my time is up. So thank you all very much.